Because we're looking now at decarbonisation and how to do that, how to move Cobalt to a low carbon environment. Lovely, thank you. Do you want to come and take a seat? Lovely. So, delighted that we have got this session now for you to really do a deep dive into the challenges, the easy things to sort out, and those that are going to be a little tougher. So please welcome from the Cobalt Institute, the Senior Sustainability Manager, Tom Fairlie.
Thank you for joining this session. Like I say, this is a session that intersects some of the different panels that we've had so far. And I hope we end this panel on a positive note as well, navigating some of the challenges around decarbonisation. So why I named this panel the New Prize? It's a reference to Dan Jurgen's epic doorstop book of the same title. So Jurgen was taking a quote from Winston Churchill, and here the prize was fuel oil for ships for the Navy, which led on to our fossil fuel era and the rapid global warming that resulted. So the New Prize, it's not just the critical raw materials we need for the green transition to address the damage done so far from the Industrial Revolution onwards, but it's about the low carbon materials so we can reduce our impacts as quickly as possible. And I think this is in the context of the long-term increase in demand that we've seen that Harry showed us the other day. So EVs, the production of EVs is almost being used and seen as a proxy for decarbonisation. Unless we reduce the impacts as soon as possible, we're just going to continue to add to the problems. So Cobalt has a huge potential to have a positive impact as part of the green transition. And Carly Long yesterday vividly sort of described that with great intervention. So today's session won't be focusing on Cobalt as an enabler of decarbonisation, but rather how we can decarbonise, and this in a world of tight supply and supply of potentially high carbon materials as well. So I'd like to invite our panel to the stage if you'd like to join and introduce you. Thank you. And a round of applause for our panel. Yeah.
I think it's still on. Oh.
Perfect. Is that working? Wonderful. Technology then. Excellent. So thank you very much for joining us. To introduce the panel, we have Bruna Grossl, Senior LCA Practitioner at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. She provided key inputs to our State of the Market report and showed like the real power of LCA analysis. Alice Lim, Head of Corporate Sustainability, London Metal Exchange. Alice recently stepped into the role, so I'm sure it's a pretty busy time, so we're really glad to have you here today. Robyn, Stoney, Manager, Regulatory Affairs for Nickel and Cobalt at Glencore. It's great to have you on the panel. You're an active participant in our Responsible Sourcing and Sustainability Committee, so that's great to have you. Robert Ellenwood, President of New Providence Metals. Robert, of course, giving us some reflections and insights from Sherritt. And last but not least, Sam Whittlesey from LGI, an analyst. And Sam's been working with us on circular economy, which has included some really interesting work on regeneration of natural systems and opportunities with mining technologies. So interested to hear your reflections later today. So I'm going to start, before we go into the individual sort of interventions, I've got a question for the panel, just in a few words as possible. Cost or carbon footprint, what's going to be the biggest driver in the market in the long term? I'll start, Sam.
I think that cost is still going to be an important driver of the market. I'd like to see carbon accounting take a larger role, but we'll get into some of the specifics of how that could be possible later.
Absolutely. Alice.
I'm going to give a politician answer and go both. I think at the moment the cost and the commercial is the big motivator, but longer term I think the carbon will have a huge role to play, and it might even become kind of licensed to operate, so then overtaking the cost factor.
Right. Bruna.
Yes, I agree with Alice, and I would like to say it depends. If you're thinking long term, and then the market that you are speaking about, like the EU or US, then I believe long term carbon emissions, they are being pushed, and we are seeing more transparency through that as well.
Great. Robyn?
Well, I'm going to disagree and say, understand that it's often cost, but actually carbon is changing the way, businesses are structured. It's changing the whole way that we operate right now. We are in the middle of a major change, which is all about carbon.
Wow.
And it's expensive, right?
Yeah, for sure. We'll get on to that. And finally, Robert.
I guess I'd like to agree with everybody, but I do have a slightly different answer. I think it's regional will be part of it, but also it's the cost of maybe the vehicle or the technology that the customer needs to adopt to go along this journey to electrification. If those costs aren't low enough, it might be difficult to adopt those.
Brilliant. I think that's a great reflection. And I'm actually going to turn to the audience now. And so cost or carbon footprint. If you think cost is going to be the major driver, can you put your hand up and as high as possible so I can see who we've got? A few people there. And carbon footprint. No one. Goodness. It appears negative externalities maybe aren't being priced in at the moment. So we're going to have some interventions now from the panel. We will have opportunities for questions. We really do value your reflections as well, so please do indicate and we'll give you opportunity to ask questions. But I'd really like to start off with Bruna giving us some wider context to the situation. I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Just waiting for the presentation.
Click through. There we go.
Great. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'll try to set a scene for our discussion today. I'll give a brief overview of sustainability within the cobalt supply. So nothing new from what we were talking in the past days here at the event, but I'd like to point out about demand and supply. So we see in the short and medium term that supply will match demand. But then, in the long-term future, we actually see a big shortage. And that's where we come with the discussion on how much ESG is going to be scrutinized when we come to that point. And I've also highlighted the roadmap and the bigger players that we've been talking on and on, but DRC as the global mine, and then China as the refined supply, but now Indonesia coming with significant volumes as well. So the regulatory push and geopolitical agenda. I like to think at them as enablers of responsible sourcing. It brings the discussion, it helps to build partnerships, and it gives that push for due diligence. We had a great expert section in the first day where our colleague Bart mentioned the frameworks and standards that are being put in place that will drive that push. And like I pointed out in the slides, the Inflation Reduction Act, the EU Green Deal, they are all setting the pace that it is will happen. Also, I would like to point out the EU battery passport with carbon footprint being a requirement, water consumption, and recycled content. One of the limits that it's been set by now, it's like 16% of recycled content of cobalt. And Harry already pointed out that for now, the majority of it comes from scrap. So we really need to be starting these discussions around where this material will come from and the processing of those materials as well, because it comes with a burden. It's not just because we are using a material existent that it doesn't go through more processing to get our metals needed. And again, on the partnerships, it's interesting to see different perspectives about them. We kind of see the MSP being more of a buyer's club, whereas the European club is kind of trying to make alliances and get to those suppliers to diversify. their supply. But I see these are all long-term initiatives that we're going to see results. As benchmark forecasts highlights, we see Chinese firms that will have a stake of more than 50% of cobalt supply by the end of the decade. So there is a lot to go on within the West players. And LCAs, so life cycle assessments. This is my specialty, and whenever I talk about it, there is a phrase that stuck with me: what you measure, you can manage. So I often look at the company's website, talking about how they're worried about sustainability, how they're striving to do the best, how they're going to help this energy transition. And then when it comes to reporting on disclosing the systems in place, then we don't see numbers, and it doesn't help the conversation. Many of them are doing great things, and we just want to make them strive to do better and to report on them as well. With life cycle assessments, we don't focus only on carbon emissions. We look of a holistic view, looking at impact categories like eutrophication, acidification, so you can better talk about trade-offs within alternative routes. So when you look at, for example, where we highlighted here the traditional cobalt route at DRC refined in China, and then we look at HPAL produced in Indonesia and further refined in China, we see that there is a potential for higher environmental impact throughout the categories here assessed, not only carbon emissions. And this is only what the data can take us. But if you think about the tailings, that it's a well-known issue in Indonesia, they've been banned to be discharged into the oceans, but there is a lack of enforcement, and that is the issue. But also studies in toxicity, so we better understand what are these impacts, and so we could measure with tools like that to truly estimate that impact of the significant route. So there is a lot to do still. And for this, I bring a little overview on how we look at sustainability reporting within our ESG report. So we take these key material topics and analyze how companies are performing, looking through all the publicly available data from ESG reports to press releases. And we often see an existing gap between what they are discussing and what they are reporting. So that's interesting. They discuss about the issue, they recognize it is important, but we don't see systems being implemented. And if you look at just of these topics here, the majority don't even achieve 50% of the companies. So they are either are they not monitoring it, aren't systems in places, or they're simply not reporting, which is an issue when we are trying to talk of how important this is in the industry and to these companies to show that they care and they are doing their best, even if it is an estimation, even if it is beginning stages, it's important to put it out there. And within like carbon footprint assessments and LCAs, we see that there are higher carbon footprint being assessed and lower LCAs, whilst I see this as an important holistic view, so people can often assess these trade-offs that we were talking a little bit before. And then just briefly with the Indonesian side, the biodiversity indicators that we are seeing here, it's a similar scenario when you look at nickel companies. So we expect to see an increased number in this, given the importance of that supply. And just to finalize, a brief overview of the global mine supply. We see that actually 3/4 of that global mine cobalt tonnage, it's conducted with a middling to positive level of ESG consideration. This is based in our benchmark tiering methodology, where we basically rank companies in more than 40 criteria and give them a tiering section. When you look at the bar graph that I put together, when you compare DRC to the rest of the world, they actually are not that different when you're considering both juniors and minors. So there is a lot that the cobalt supply chain has to do. And still, we haven't included the future legislation in the forecasted levels of ESG. So we definitely will see a change of more companies joining those better levels. And again, this type of ranking is for an evolving nature. As topics become more and less salient, this level of consideration will change as well. It goes within the discussions in the industry and what is most important for everyone. Yeah, hopefully that set a bit of a scene, and looking forward to discuss a little bit further.
Wonderful. Thanks very much for that. I think really interesting, especially at the end, you're sort of ranking, and I think in the context, yesterday Harry was talking, you're tracking something like 25 to 40 potential projects in Indonesia, so there might be supply, but there's potentially these sorts of impacts associated with a large number of projects that are going to be moving forward, so we have challenges ahead.
Definitely.
Excellent. I'll hand over now to Alice, who's going to give a perspective from Ellenwood. Thank you.
Perfect. So before I dive in, I think it's always useful to kind of state that I'll be giving the exchange view, which is kind of the broader sustainability outlook. But before I dive in, what is the LME? We are the largest market in options and futures contracts, so that is within the base metal space. So we do have a cobalt contract. But that is not on the sustainability side, so I will now dive into the sustainability side and lead off where Bruna finished, which was the challenges piece. I think it's no surprise that these challenges have popped up in nearly every panel, regardless of whether it was sustainability-based discussion or not. So a couple of the kind of key areas, especially that are facing on the sustainability side, are those that you can see on the screen now. These are not an exhaustive list. I wish it was. But what I'm hopefully going to do is kind of run through the challenges and then how the exchange is kind of hopefully planning on alleviating some of those and kind of moving forward. So hopefully ending on a slightly more positive note. So on the greenwashing side, for those of you that are not aware, this is when companies kind of overmarket themselves on the E side, so the environmental side. This is not every company, and I think there's a nice balance between people who are greenwashing, but then not scrutinizing too heavily to then cause green hushing. And I'll go on to the transparency importance moving forward. The definition piece fits in so nicely with the greenwashing piece. Sometimes people don't intentionally greenwash. It's a lack of education and a lack of understanding of how to work things out. But that all feeds back into the definitions piece. If anyone here could give me a really clear definition of exactly what is included within Scope 3, I will give you everything I own. Because it is an absolute Wild West out there, but it carries across to even the simplest definitions. Every company will have a different definition of exactly what sustainability even is. And I think that kind of feeds into the problem of moving towards that low carbon space, because what is low carbon? It's anyone's guess. Demand-supply paradox, I think Bruna covered that very nicely. I think it's the changing landscape we will see moving forward is something that will be very interesting. How do we kind of meet the demands of the EV and kind of energy transition, but also kind of looking at the supply piece. Expectations across the supply chain. As an exchange, we are very nicely placed and we sit within kind of the center of the supply chain. So we do engage kind of up and down. We talk to the miners, the producers, the manufacturers, your OEMs, your NGOs, you name it, we've probably spoken to them. And on that front, I think people are kind of either starting out their sustainability journeys, still working out kind of what that looks like, but that often means that there's kind of a little bit of a mismatch in terms of what people are asking for. And as we kind of represent the producer side a lot of the time, that sometimes means that they're then asked to do 101 different standards or measure against slightly different metrics, and we don't want them to be spending all their time doing audits and buried in that piece of work. We want to kind of help move the program forward. Final one is trade-offs, E versus S versus G. At what cost do we kind of put all our eggs in one basket and go for the low carbon discussion? On the cobalt side, I think there are kind of a lot of other sustainability issues associated, and there are different sustainability issues for each metal. So on the aluminum side, or aluminium, sorry, you have kind of this huge disarray between the emission side, and the range that you can get between producers is massive. You can go from people who have, almost 0 tons of emissions up to 25 tons, whereas on the cobalt side, it is a much smaller kind of gap, I suppose you could say. So looking at kind of that piece. So I've complained enough. So I'm actually going to give you some positive kind of road and how you get from kind of A to B. How do we get to that kind of low carbon area? So my first step is the transparency and trust piece. So as you can hopefully see on screen now, I've just given 3 nice, easy, simple steps to reaching that. The first one from our side is transparency. At the LME, this is our huge push in terms of what we're trying to do. getting people to share their work they're doing and showcase the good work that they're doing within the ESG space is of vital importance, because it then means that will feed into the second piece. You can actually use that data. I always like to say the phrase, you can't reduce what you don't measure, and I think that stands very clearly. But the second piece feeds into that so vitally, because I think there's a lot of different ways of working out your emissions at the moment, and I think there's a lot of great work that's being done at the moment to kind of help alleviate that. So I'll go on to kind of the role of standards and kind of methodologies, but very quickly I know that kind of Cobalt Institute, as an example, have started doing LCA work, and that will kind of help into feeding into working out accurate data. Once you have that accurate data, that then means you can build on that year on year, start collecting the emissions, and actually use that to then either reduce your emissions, but also build trust in the markets that people actually believe you actually are producing those amount of emissions. The final piece of the puzzle is that values and cost piece, and I think this is the most talked about because it's back to the commercial point. Where do people see the value? At the moment, I think producers are pouring in hundreds of thousands, if not millions, into this environmental or sustainable journey. But when do they kind of see the benefit of that on the kind of cost side? Unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that. But it does mean that kind of having all of that data, that will help to kind of sell that story longer term. And if you don't have that data, you can't kind of back that up with a potential premium looking forward. There are industries where they've started seeing premiums on the sustainability side, so the hope is that you start seeing them on the Cobalt side, but again, that is anyone's guess. So how is the LME going to help with that? As you can see on screen, we've got a lovely LME passport slide there. This is our kind of big push to kind of encourage the transparency piece. So we have a public page where our producers can showcase their ESG credentials. That is across the board. That's not just the emissions piece. That is your social side, your human rights, your RMI, your CCC, whatever it may be. And that is kind of the starting point for us so that people can, anyone in the supply chain can see that information, and it's in a kind of searchable, usable way to help that kind of data piece. So as you can see, hopefully it's not too small. Kwayu, who were here earlier in the conference, albeit virtually, they have got a producer profile page, which very nicely shows some of the kind of ESG credentials that they have worked towards. And it's a great way for people further down the supply chain to use it as kind of a one-stop shop where they can load in and say, hey, what are you actually doing? And you don't have to scroll through endless pages of sustainability reports to find that information. Before I go on too much, it's not a sales pitch, it is free. We're just trying to push the transparency. So the final one that I've got is kind of the role of standards, which I've touched on very briefly. The LME is not a standard setter. We're not here to recreate the wheel. We're aware that there are loads of very good standards, certifications, and metrics out there. We are just trying to encourage usage of those standards. So there are great ones out there that have already been talked about. I'm not going to run through them in depth. I'll be here for hours, but RMI is an example. Again, the Cobalt Institute working on kind of the LCA piece, having those environmental impacts, and then moving forward and kind of refining down into the emissions piece is a great starting point. And it doesn't need to necessarily all be within the emissions space. The final piece is the industry buy-in piece and making sure that there's equivalencies and convergence so that producers don't have to do 101 different standards to kind of meet the industry standard per se. So that nicely wraps me up into our taxonomy wheel, and I think this kind of agrees very nicely with what Bruna was saying. I don't think it's a focus all on kind of the low carbon road. A lot of the time, if you do a certification or metric, it will help out in the longer term on the emissions side. So a lot of them are multidimensional standards where they focus not only on the emissions front, but they look at the human rights aspects. They look at the recycling, the circular economy, biodiversity. And I think that is kind of the nice piece, that everything is the broader piece of sustainability. Just because you might not be directly focusing on it, it will probably help you longer term to kind of build that kind of, I suppose, cross the finishing line. And with that, I will hand back to Tom.
Thank you very much. Some really interesting reflections there. Where you ended, the broader sustainability, not just carbon, I think that's really important. And at the start of this week on Tuesday, at the environmental due diligence session, we were looking at that intersection between, say, decarbonisation and the effect on people as well, just transition. So it's really pleasing to see that there. And of course, on the standard side, at the moment, the Cobalt Institute are currently writing a product carbon footprint guidance document, and we hope that will be sort of adopted as part of what you're using with LME Passport as well. So really, really wonderful to hear. Robyn, over to you now.
Oh, thanks. I don't need it. Thank you. And I just have to get my iPad working. It's a problem with technology, right? So thank you, Tom, and also guests and people that have hung around to listen, and also the Cobalt Institute for the opportunity. I look after the nickel and cobalt resources that we have in Canada, Australia, New Caledonia and Norway. So I don't specifically speak to the DRC operations, although I can cover it to an extent. So Glencore looks to bring the best standards of performance to all of our operations, wherever they are in the world. Marie-Chantal mentioned that this morning, and I think it is important about when you work for a large global company, you know, having that understanding that this can be the way we do things, the way we roll around here for everywhere you are in the business. And I think the global market is moving together towards decarbonisation, which is a really positive thing. Our climate ambitions at Glencore are consistent with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and also the Paris Agreement. Specifically, our pathway to net zero targets a 15% reduction on 2019 emissions levels by 2026, 50% by 2035, and our ambition is to be net zero across our industrial assets by 2050. We have business processes that support us to achieve these decarbonisation aims. So we go through a process of assessing our options and capability around decarbonisation and sharing that within the whole group. So we have 135,000 employees in Glencore, and the people that are working on decarbonisation have access to each other through our business processes so that we can equalise technical capability across our global operations. For example, technical people that are working on a particular project in decarbonisation can access technical people in another part of the business, in another part of the world, who are working on similar decarbonisation projects through our business process structure. So I think that's very helpful to us, and it is a game changer in terms of rapidly developing the technical capacity to change. Excuse me. Examples of how we will reduce our Scope 1 footprint is through things like fleet electrification, utilising new technology and equipment, and collaborating with peers and equipment manufacturers. We have specialist renewable energy purchase personnel who engage with contracting energy supply for our operations. So we have a business, a London power desk, as we call it, that supports the entire business. Where we're not excuse me, connected to grids and reliant on local electricity generation, we're developing options for on-site renewable energy systems such as wind and solar. And examples of that have already been established are wind turbines at our Raglan mine in Northern Ontario to reduce diesel consumption. And in the DRC, as Marie-Chantal mentioned this morning, we're utilising hydropower. A key part of this is efficiency, and we utilise standards for our efficiency. So ISO 50001 provides a very good framework for year-on-year reductions in energy consumption. We also have supplier engagement activities, development and deployment of technologies, and input efficiency. Examples are the underground mine Napping Depth project, which is currently being constructed, will be fully electric. This is very exciting because it has a lot of other benefits aside from just the decarbonisation benefit, but certainly that's a big thing. Deployment of electric highway transport semi-trucks, use of hydrogen fuel cell powered vehicles and shortened haulage routes are examples of other things that we're doing with third parties to ensure that across our supply chain we can make these decarbonisation options work. At Nickelverk, we recently introduced electric trucks. This is a big thing for electric, right? Because it is difficult to get the delivery of efficient materials movement using electric trucks. But in fact, when we put our trucks on the road in Nickelwerk, we found that because they're only using local roads, so they're travelling at 60 kilometres an hour most of the time, they can actually carry a full payload of a normal diesel-powered truck. So it's some fantastic improvements and things to get pretty excited about. And our team is very excited about our decarbonisation plans. So if you'd like to know more about that, we do have our 2022 climate change report on our website, and I'd encourage you to take a look at that. It provides a more detailed look, I suppose, at what we have. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Robyn. I really like the piece, the sort of connection piece within the business, a large business, and I think we've already touched on the fact that there's a lot of capacity building that's needed around decarbonisation. A really great example of that. And on-the-ground electric vehicles, I can see the safety benefits as well beyond just decarbonisation. So really, really great to hear. Handing over to Robert, if you can just pass over the clicker, and you can get started. Robert, thank you.
First, just like to take a moment, Tom, thank you for the invitation. The arm twisting, I'm not sure how to say that properly. I appreciate it. The Cobalt Institute, what a wonderful conference. I know it's the last day, but I feel we could go for at least another 40 minutes by this energy level. It's been a long conference, but a wonderful one. Thank you very much. The panel, a tough act to follow. I wrote down a few notes. What you measure, you can manage. Felt that was a good theme. Greenwashing and trade-offs, really topical. And then maybe Robyn's discussion about collaboration across business teams. I think the collaboration across business teams is maybe an approach that we take. I feel we have all these, intelligent people in our organizations. Let's use that capacity to really drive real change. So anyways, my name's Robert Ellenwood, President of New Providence Metals Marketing and Sales, and also the Director of Marketing at Sherritt. So we have a strategy to make metals for the energy transition. Of course, that's nickel and cobalt in our case. And today we're talking about the low-carbon cobalt. So please take a moment to read our forward-looking statements. So our guidance, I'll start from that. We are a producer, Sherritt, so we make 30 to 32,000 tons of nickel this year as guidance, and 31 to 34 cobalt, powder and briquettes. And I'm proud to say that we do that as sustainably as possible with a focus on improving our ESG metrics at each moment. So on the technology side, we actually have a team of Sherritt Technologies that is able to, introduce us to the new and better technologies that are available so that we can grow responsibly in a more efficient manner. So they help us out in our processes and also things like life of mine, which, it's life of mine. What does that mean? Well, it means using more of what you have instead of, side piling it if it's not quite good enough. So a great utilization of ore. Which has brought us to a 2048 mine life, so quite a few years. This increased mine life gives us a good opportunity in leading the green metals production, where we have executed on our expansion program. We have a 20% coming, and all this towards a sustainable organization where we can deliver year-over-year improvements. And how are we currently doing this? At least the roadmap now. It's really a journey, isn't it? It's not just a set of questionnaires you fill out, but it's actually like boots on the ground, shovels in dirt, and some leaching in our case. So we're increasing our mixed sulfide production in Cuba by 20%, and this is going to help us. During this project, we're improving on a slurry preparation plant, which is closer to the processing, so that we can reduce our haulage distances, bringing lower carbon intensity throughout our operation. The extension of our mine life to 2048 not only, I think, provides materials for the transition, and an expectation that we will be there for the long haul, right? To keep going with our partners, and increasing the refinery efficiency. Our operations aren't all new, so now's a good time to refresh them, and take the opportunity to use these new wonderful technologies that are not only maybe brings you cost-effective benefits, but also efficiency benefits. And that's all good, because we have this opportunity with this transition to really change the world a couple % at a time. But if we're all doing that, what a wonderful opportunity. Our commitment to ESG has 4 pillars in this case I'll share with you: health and safety, climate and environment, diversity and inclusion, and responsible sourcing. So we're going towards achieving level A in TSM, that's towards sustainable mining, by 24. Our net zero target is 2050, and having 15% energy from renewables by 2030, with a reduction on NOx, or nitrogen oxide emissions, by 10% for 24. And part of our D&I framework is to increase the women in the workforce. By accounts here, we're 50-50. Okay, we're doing okay on the panel at least. Well, no, better than 50-50. Tom, I'm not including you on the panel in this case. Okay. And to be fully compliant on responsible sourcing frameworks. I liked your comment saying, which one do you chase? Which one do you follow? And hopefully we have some consolidation in that, so we can bring, can I say, an efficiency to that as well. It takes energy and effort and electrons to fire a computer up to write all those reports. I think that will help, but this all can bring us to a roadmap, bring us to how do we get there? And I'm happy to say we have some brilliant minds in our organization, not just on the technical side, but the regulatory side and the how you get things done side, because sometimes they don't all go at the same pace. But our teams have kind of evaluated each step in our process and said, could we squeeze a couple of units of efficiency out of here? Maybe there's an opportunity to purchase a different kind of carbon content material to bring into our process. Why don't we use this huge light bulb a few million miles away that provides free energy, at a cost for the implementation, but good return on investment over time. These are opportunities, and it does take some capital. So, will cost win out, or will carbon win out? I'm not sure. Thankfully, we have an organization that is able to generate cash, and that means I have a job once in a while, and I'm sure we're all thankful for that. So these technologies can cost money; they're an investment, and but as long as we can keep selling and producing sustainably, I think we should all be able to survive and really do better in the world. So. I hope that's a positive note that we could kind of almost finish on. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
No, thank you. I think you touched on some really interesting points. Efficiency is often overlooked with decarbonisation. You look at renewables and the electricity you use, the fuels you use, but even just process efficiencies and the primary energy demand reduction can have really big impacts. I think we'll get on to capital later and perhaps technologies as well. But I'll like to finish up if we can pass the parcel down to Sam, and Sam's going to finish up giving us a sort of broader overview as well with technologies. So
great. Thanks, Tom, for the introduction, and thanks to the Cobalt Institute for inviting me on stage today. I'm really happy to be here with you. So I work for a company called LGI Sustainable Innovation. We're based in Paris, France. Our mission is to identify and upscale sustainable innovations, such as the ones that I'm going to be presenting today. So today I'd like to present 4 general themes, which I'm calling systemic innovation to decarbonize cobalt value chains. So I'd like to look at the entire value chain and kind of give you a vision of what the value chain could look like in the future if it were to be fully carbon neutral. So first, to start off, we've heard from the fellow panelists also there's a major challenge facing us all. So the science is clear. To avoid catastrophic tipping points in the Earth's climate system, we must decarbonize, and we need to do it very quickly. So we've heard a lot about net zero by 2050, but it's important to remember that we need to cut 45% by 2030 in order to stay in line with the 1.5 degree target that was laid out in the Paris Accords. That target is important because the Earth isn't just heating. When we disrupt the Earth's climate system, we're also disrupting our food system, our water system, and life on Earth itself. So it's essential to take this topic seriously. For the cobalt industry, greenhouse gas emissions primarily come from two sources. So this is based on the life cycle assessment conducted by the Cobalt Institute. So that is auxiliaries, so solvents, separating agents, et cetera, other chemicals, and energy. So that's the electricity used to power the mine, and also diesel fuel. At the same time as we're trying to dramatically scale down emissions, we have this challenge facing cobalt industry specifically, that the climate technologies of the future will require a lot of carbon. So Europe is expected to have a 400% increase in demand if they're going to meet their climate targets, for instance. So that's the challenge ahead of us. How do we get there? The first systemic innovation that I'd like to talk about is looking at mining as part of a nexus with the energy system. So thinking about cobalt mines as renewable energy prosumers, so both consumers and producers of renewable energy. So the good news is that renewable energy is now the cheapest form of energy ever produced in human history, specifically if we look at solar with battery storage. So I was really glad to hear that Robyn mentioned that Glencore is investing in renewable energy production on site. I was glad to hear in the previous panel on the DRC that investments in energy were also brought up. Another solution that is part of this idea would be to then use that renewable energy that is invested in via mining companies or via the revenue generated from mining to then electrify heavy machinery. So the ICMM estimates that that can save up to 68 million tons of CO2 annually if we were to electrify mining fleets around the world. Then we also need to think about electricity consumption at the mine site in terms of reducing demand. The easiest way to do that would be to look at comminution, which is the primary consumer of electricity at the mine site. So 3% of all energy used around the world is used to crush and grind raw materials. If we can invest in new technologies to improve sorting or to improve the rate at which we crush and grind materials, that can have major consequences for decarbonizing the mine site as well. And it's important to remember that specifically for the cobalt industry as well, if we invest in renewable energy production in the DRC, that can really have a positive social impact and really transform the development trajectory of that country. It's important to remember that only 19% of Congolese citizens at this stage have access to electricity, so this can really transform the path of that country. The next systemic innovation I'd like to present would be to consider tailings from a holistic perspective and view them not just as a waste product, but as something that can really generate environmental value and also economic value. So that's what I'm calling tailings as a carbon sink. So first and foremost, tailings can contribute to decarbonization through what's called mineral carbonation. So this is a naturally occurring process that happens as part of the Earth's climate system, but over many thousands of years. We can accelerate that process by using mafic and ultramafic mineral rocks present in deposits around the world. So here on the map, you can see where those deposits have been identified. I'd particularly like to highlight that in Indonesia and New Caledonia, there's large deposits of ultramafic rocks that are very suitable for mineral carbonation. So the idea there is that we convert magnesium and calcium-containing minerals into carbonates that permanently capture CO2 from the atmosphere and store it in mineral form. And it's estimated that that can save roughly 300 million tons of CO2 annually if we were to fully valorize mining waste around the world for this purpose. The other way that tailings can really contribute to global decarbonization is through their use as a bulk material in construction. So around 7 to 8% of all global CO2 emissions come from the cement industry. And if we were to replace a portion of the bulk materials used in concrete with tailings, that can offer roughly 1/3 emission savings there. So again, if we were to think if that were to scale to the entire planet, that's 2 to 3% of global emissions that could be reduced by valorizing tailings in construction. Both of those solutions are present in the third systemic innovation that I'd like to mention here on stage today. So here you have this really elegant flow sheet that I've borrowed from 2 researchers out of the University of KU Leuven. I really recommend that everyone in the audience, when you're flying home, take a look at this paper they've produced. It's called The 12 Principles for Circular Hydrometallurgy. I don't have time to go into detail on all 12 of those principles, but the fundamental idea behind their methodology is that hydrometallurgical systems should be designed where we are regenerating the reagents that are used in those systems as much as possible. So that can really help us tackle one of the major sources of emissions for the cobalt industry, which, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, is auxiliaries and leaching agents. The way that they have proposed to do this is through cycling protons back into the system to reproduce those acids, and they're doing that with green hydrogen gas and through CO2. So again, here you can see on the left, they're using solvent-extracted assisted carbonation, so cycling CO2 back into the system, regenerating the acid that can then be used to leach your concentrate again, and at the same time producing mineral carbonates that, like I mentioned earlier, can be stored safely and physically remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And then I'd finally like to conclude my discussion today with something that hasn't been mentioned so much in the previous discussions, which it focused a lot on responsible sourcing of cobalt. I'd also like to introduce the topic of responsible use of cobalt. And so I think that downstream actors and OEMs also have their role to play in driving decarbonization. So on screen here, you can see an image which presents a variety of different dots. Each dot represents a vehicle on the US market right now. Then on the bottom, you can see that their life cycle emissions have been scaled from left to right. So you can see 2 things here. The first is that, generally speaking, electric vehicles are much less carbon intensive. So the transition that's underway is obviously a very positive thing. But it's important to note that because of the emissions that are embedded within the battery, and also because of the emissions that come from the grid, electric vehicles still do emit carbon. And there is a clear trade-off between the size of that vehicle and the amount of carbon intensity that that vehicle has. And so I'm from Texas. I understand that American consumers like big trucks. But I also just wanted to mention that if we really wanted to be serious about decarbonizing our transportation systems, we need to also think about ways to reduce the use of battery materials as well. And so finally, I'd like to close with a few ways that we can responsibly use batteries once they've already been produced. So this is really aiming at OEMs, I guess. The first would be to invest in sourcing low-carbon cobalt. Hopefully we can get to that in the panel. Then design batteries that are built to last. Transform your business model in a way that we can maximize the use of the battery once it's in the vehicle. So whether that's through shared mobility systems, vehicle-to-grid systems, using the battery as a service, and then thinking about once the battery has been produced, if you're an OEM, try to recover that battery, remanufacture it, repurpose it, reuse it for secondary uses, and then eventually, if it does need to be recycled, do that in a way that is as low emissions as possible. So thank you for your attention, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Sam. I'm glad you touched on just transition with energy production and access to energy, responsible use of cobalt as well. I think this, under-discussed. We have about half an hour left on the panel, so I really want to get stuck into some of the topics, and there's a bit of an arc of conversation I'd like to get into. I want to touch on data first. You know, Robert, you beat me to it. The quotes, what you can measure, you can manage, Bruna, and you can't reduce what you can't measure. Alice, both some great points there. So, I guess the value of reliable data. What are we doing with data now? How can you see data being used going forward? What are off-takers asking for, and what are producers willing to share? I'll start, Alice, with yourself, and perhaps, what are your brands offering, and what are those using your market actually asking for as far as data and willingness to share?
Yeah. So first off, a brand is someone who has listed our exchange. I know that there's a lot of lingo floating around. In terms of the data piece, if we look at kind of the broader sustainability piece or another section of sustainability on the social side, I think a lot of the companies have done a lot of the due diligence work associated with the human rights piece, and the data that is now coming out of that is great, of great quality, and is much better than the emissions piece, I've got to say. So I think that's kind of the suit that we can follow. And I think it was very nicely put in the last panel of kind of learning lessons of where things have gone well in the past and where things haven't gone so well in the past, and kind of utilizing that as kind of the base for when we're looking at data. So if you look at the aluminum market, they are much further ahead on the emissions journey than they are on the cobalt side. That's not to say that cobalt hasn't made some huge advances, but the aluminium market is kind of based off emissions at the moment. So you can kind of look at them and kind of see what data they're using. So they've established a very clear methodology that people are now using to measure against. So using that as kind of the starting point, I think, is the great first step. In terms of the mismatch that Tom mentioned, I think it's very up in the air in terms of up to the consumers and the banks in terms of what they're actually looking for, and vocalizing what they're looking for in terms of the metrics and kind of the data that they want. There's a whole host of things that people can work out on the emissions front. It's not just your scope 1, 2, and 3. So I can't speak for the OEMs and the banks, but I think that's kind of the big next step, is them vocalizing exactly what they would like to see, to then help make a nice clear step for producers, miners, and so forth, to then kind of tangibly kind of start making that change on the data front.
Absolutely. It'd be great to see the upstream producer view. Robyn, what sort of requested data are you getting? Is it consistent? What's the way forward? What can you share?
What sort of requests are we getting? Many.
Yeah.
I think the market is strongly motivated around getting the data and getting it right. We understand well the criticality of that. There's definitely a sense that we're all asking the same questions of each other. So look at him. But I think those definitions and the refining of that and the validity of the information is super important. Importantly, I think a number is going to come with some qualifications around it that enable that use in, we're each in a different industry sector, and some things are not just viable in our industry sector that might be viable somewhere else. So I think a number is going to come with some qualifications, and I think the number may even be more like 2 or 3 numbers or 4 or 5 numbers that are then all valid in a context, but that context has some definition around it as well. Yeah. So rather than looking, I want the silver bullet of there's the number, I can put that in my model and then I can have, my number. It might be, okay, well, here's a stack of numbers that will suit various contexts.
And I'm thinking of the GBA battery passport and that approach there for dual reporting on electricity being a great example of that, absolutely. Yeah. And so, Robert, as well, data, how important, you're talking about technologies and pathways that you're starting to look at. How are you using these data to inform what you're doing there?
Thanks for the question. So the data we use is you have to measure, what your inputs and outputs are, and then understand, how much energy you need in each section of your refinery or mine, and then plan accordingly to build that size megawatt solar plant farm to understand, your inputs, understand which ones are lower or higher carbon, and see how you can reduce that footprint. Maybe it means everyone kind of chases the same things, but it does mean that when you identify what's important to you on an ESG framework side, it gives you, it gives your whole company a chance to focus on that. And this does become a barrier to entry for certain industries, where I need this number or else I can't buy your stuff. I don't think. I think that can be a challenge for some of our industry to meet those numbers, which is okay and terrible all at the same time, but it does provide some focus to the industry to improve. And I know some frameworks are built on a better tomorrow. So your number today, understand that you have the drive to improve that is important. Whether it be, like our material is non-CARA, non-child labor, non-slave labor, so we're proud of that, and you just make sure that you continue along that path so that your business partners understand that they're getting material that they can trust as well, and for a long time, in our case, till at least 2048.
Yeah. And trust, very, very important piece there with those relationships. Barrier to entry, we'll get onto that in a minute. Bruna, how do you see LCA being used going forwards and developed, and the demand for this data? How are we going to cope with that as well? There's a lot of requests, there's a lot of data and updates that are needed, so perhaps you could...
Yeah, I think there is a lot to talk about it, and it kind of complements on what Robert was saying of understanding our process, taking account of those inputs, energy consumption, and being able to use them to get to those needed numbers to understand the hotspots, and then start talking about trade-offs of let's check our suppliers, let's check our energy consumption, how we can make it more efficient as well. And in a sense, I would like to bring as well to the discussion the need for standardization, in a sense of the industries are so different. When you talk about nickel, cobalt, or lithium, it can't be one single way of calculating those emissions. So coming with frameworks that the industry agrees upon, it will bring credibility to those numbers. I think this is why important that everyone agrees of how to get all those metrics as well. Otherwise, everyone will have a different number, and then they are not comparable because they did not follow certain patterns of that calculation, and then you're not truly comparing apples to apples. I think there is a lot that LCAs can evolve and be more precise and more accurate and help in those discussions as well. I think it's always just an estimation of potential impact, but it helps to have this informed discussion, and in my feed, like the passport that is evolving with huge beneficial of transparency. Yeah.
Excellent, thanks. Sam, any last reflections on data?
Yeah, so I think several things. So I want to agree that I think having a harmonized framework is really essential. Yeah. From my perspective, I do a lot of thinking and imagining about what the future could look like. I think one of the ways that we can finance some of the solutions I was looking at was through carbon offsets or through emissions trading schemes or other mechanisms like that. And I think the gap between actually implementing that and where we are today is really a lack of concise, harmonized data to understand exactly how much additional carbon would be removed from the atmosphere by the different solutions I mentioned, especially mineral carbonation. There's a lot of work to be done to get the science straight on exactly the rate at which it occurs. And so I think having a harmonized framework in place will really be key to upscaling a lot of those different solutions.
Which is a really nice sort of segue, the lack of data being a challenge for these schemes, and you touched on financing, which sort of moves me on to the next segment. Who's going to pay for this? We're talking about technologies and opportunities to change processes, invest in renewables, invest in electric fleets. These are big costs that producers are bearing, and we're seeing that there are barriers to entry, as saying Robert, to gain access to markets if you don't meet certain levels. So, how are we going to finance that? Who's going to pay? I'll go back to you, Robyn, because you mentioned the barrier to entry, and I think that's a nice start.
Sorry, the question is, who's going to pay for it?
Yeah.
If it's an electric vehicle, the person buying the vehicle in some way, or through taxes. I mean, there's credits that are available in different governments to encourage the use of this. But I mean, it will be the company's money that they have to pay for it in some way. But I mean, there's intelligent and really innovative ways to do that. If you have a long life asset, to 2048 for us, we can plan out that long and build that solar plant, build that concentrated solar gathering equipment that will last the life of our mine, and you'll be able to write it off over time as it produces this energy that you require anyways. So I think if you're in it for the long haul, I think you have some technologies that can make it over that hump of cost, because it's an investment and there needs to be some return on investment, or else you don't survive, right? If it becomes too costly, no one's going to build a mine, right? You don't do it for free or for negative, right? So I think it comes to that, but the fantastic thing is I think there's a general momentum that it's going to happen regardless, and using our materials more efficiently and using renewables is a really, seems like a good idea to be a path forward.
Yeah. Robyn, do you think your off-takers are willing to pay more because they're getting a lower carbon material? Do you think that's acceptable, in an open market?
I don't think there's a premium. I think there's certainly access to market is an important part of it. And I think the question around who's going to pay for it is we've all got to. And it's the just transition part of that and the equity part of that becomes the important discussion that we will continue to have over time about how, for example, the conversations that were had this morning in poorer parts of the world, they're not as well positioned, and support is going to be needed.
Alice.
I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle. I think both of the producers on the end have talked about kind of the efficiencies, and albeit there's a massive uplift in cost to reach those efficiencies, but I think the longer term is that then hopefully they kind of go in hand. The cost will hopefully reduce over time because they're being more efficient, but then at the same time the carbon piece will also come down at the same time. So I'm hoping that kind of goes hand in hand on that front. But in terms of who actually pays for it, you can't answer that. I think if you look around the room, would you pay 50p more for a can of Coke because you know that it's super low carbon? You can answer that question yourself, right? I don't personally think I would, and I work in sustainability. So it's about working out kind of the wants and needs of the end consumer and then working back from there. But I agree that it should be shared across the supply chain. And I think the producers and miners are doing a heck of a lot of work at the moment and doing kind of the bulk of the work to push the transition forwards.
But I mean, are you seeing that demand? You have LME passports, and so is there a demand for the material at least? Yes.
Definitely. In the last 6 to 12 months alone, the conversations we've had we've had great engagement from kind of the producer side, but on the consumer and kind of the investment community side, the conversations we've had have pivoted massively in the last year. They want to know more. They want to know where we're getting our data from, how we're working it out. I say we, the producers are working it out. But I think that shows kind of the shift in one kind of mindset, but also potentially how things are costed out and whether there is going to be the big P word, the premium coming. But
which we'll get on to very shortly. And I guess, Bruna, Sam mentioned around financing and the data gap. Any comments on that and how we can perhaps fill that gap and actually enable these, emissions trading schemes and so on that might assist in the process?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. We've seen throughout the days here at the Congress, people discussing about the gap within the producers and the buyers, and this lack of, not lack, but it's how it's hard to engage and to get through that gap to get the data. And sometimes it's not even that the data is not there, but the questions are not the right questions. And as Robert was saying, there are some barriers on how much personnel they have to assess these, on how much they can invest on those data gathering and filling forms and due diligence. That this is a challenge for many companies, and they are working on it. We see them going and saying, yeah, we are putting our money into it. We are developing that side of the company. We see companies engaging more with ESG, building ESG committees, and having their own teams to enable that, to fill that gap of data. And there is a push for it, and it will become mandatory at some point. Like, people will just have to deal with it, and the costs will come, and everyone will share it. I like to think in a little bit of a simplistic way when we think about organics. It's like you pay more to have organic food. Yeah. You pay more to have gluten-free food, and that's even an allergen, a health thing, and you need to pay more for it. So it's that naturality of those kind of products with this kind of differentiators.
No, definitely. And I think, yeah, the challenges in getting the data is probably overlooked often by the off-takers, by the downstream, and going through our LCA process. That it's a torturous process sometimes, getting good quality data that you can then actually work with. We've got a few minutes left in the session, and I do want to get on to Indonesia and this sort of topic. And Alice, you mentioned the premium. Access to market as well. Earlier yesterday, the bifurcation of the market was talked about, and there wasn't very conclusive decisions about it. But do you think there might be? We have Indonesia, where there's a lot of Chinese investment, and that material might go to China. There might not be the same requirements for that material there. And then we have other markets that are really wanting this low-carbon material. Do you see any sort of divergence? Robyn, I'll start with you.
I think there is a divergence to an extent, and it is about having support in those regions to, build capacity and grow the right way of managing things, be they about carbon neutral or lower carbon product or any other ESG topics. So definitely there is a need to address that. What the answer to that is, I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
Robert, what do you think about the idea of diverging markets? And do you think it's a reality? Do you think it creates some challenges, disincentivise even the investment to decarbonise if you have willing off-takers of high carbon material?
I think investors are making choices based on where they think the right material will come from. Does it create a divergence or continue with a global market economy that we're all in this together? It's a difficult one to comment on. I'm not sure because I don't think we're there yet, right. And we don't operate in Indonesia, so I can't really comment on that one too much. But either way, the resources and reserves are what they are. The processes to obtain those critical minerals doesn't fundamentally change. I mean, I used to be a chemist, my previous history, and thermodynamics are what they are. You're not going to really change that. So that will also lead to different global warming potential numbers for everybody.
Fair enough. So on the LME side, I mean, there's been talk of premium in the past, and we've had conversations about that. Any sort of reflections on that and the potential for the future?
Yeah, I'll say something slightly controversial. On the other kind of side of sustainability, there are certain credentials now, or kind of areas that are now licensed to operate. So it's no longer seen as kind of a premium to have the human rights due diligence piece in your supply chain. If someone kind of potentially sees this child labor, it can force them to kind of leave altogether, and that can cause more harm than good, and it's a whole other discussion. But is that the direction that the carbon kind of movement is going in? I'm not sure. The carbon piece has moved so much quicker than kind of the human rights piece. The human rights piece has been kind of in the background for 10, 15, 20 years now, but I think the carbon discussion has really escalated in the last 2-3 years. And you can see that by kind of every company now releasing net zero targets or kind of releasing their ambitions where they'd like to go. So I would like to say that maybe there might be one in the short term, but then longer term, does it then become kind of the new norm that you have to be operating at X tons of carbon? Who knows? Yeah, I think that's probably the best answer I can give on premiums.
So potentially there is a premium, but actually that might bring everything along in the long term.
Exactly. There'll always be leaders in the market who kind of lead the charge and start the great work. And it's whether the remaining players can, I don't like to use the term catch up, but kind of meet that new baseline and what that baseline actually looks like moving forward. So I think there's separation at the moment, but longer term.
Brilliant. Which is a really nice transition to this last area. I wanted to end on something positive. How do we encourage decarbonisation across the markets so that the demand for these materials can actually be met? Sam, I'll start with you here. And we talked about various mechanisms the other day, and perhaps just briefly touch on that.
Yeah. So I am slightly optimistic because I do think a lot of these solutions to drive lower carbon production are already starting to make business sense. So it now is becoming more and more viable to electrify mining equipment that's offering operating cost savings, reducing your energy consumption at the mine site. That also offers major operating cost savings. If you can regenerate your leaching agents, that can offer operating cost savings. So in that sense, I'm becoming more and more optimistic about that. In terms of the trickier bits to improve and decarbonize, I think there is going to be a need for both public and private finance. And so that could come through the form of, like I mentioned earlier, emissions trading schemes and public subsidies for decarbonizing industry. But that could also come through private carbon markets, for instance.
Excellent. No, thanks, Sam. And Robyn, carbon trading schemes, CBAM, do you think that might control or create some?
Is it annoying? Just a bit. I'm sure that those things are already having their effect. They're driving the assessments. We're getting ever more detailed MPV calculations, taking into account the localised emissions trading. So, yeah, it's going to achieve the aim.
I think a fairer question perhaps is how can we engage with government and policymakers to drive decarbonisation?
Absolutely, and we do that through the industry organisations like the Cobalt Institute, and thank you, Tom. That is a huge benefit in having these conversations, is having some industry-wide advocacy.
Excellent. Robert, any reflections on that as well? What can we do, how can we engage with policymakers, with governments, with the market to really drive that decarbonisation?
Really engagement with institutes like the Cobalt Institute and the Nickel Institute. We're members of both because fundamentally, we mine stuff and we leach stuff and we engineer and research stuff and then we make some products. So I'm not certain that's our positioning in the global marketplace. So we have partners to bring those expert opinions.
Excellent. Yeah, I think partnering is going to be key. Bruna, we're running out of time, so just end with you briefly. You know, you showed this growth in demand and this middling performance. Do you think we can bring the industry up together? And yeah, any reflections on that and how we might achieve that?
Oh, I'm optimistic. Here from our colleagues here, we can see that they are in the right track already, that people are striving to do best, to do better, and I see more engagement. I see the need for engagement with people trying to get together. It's something that we've been seeing recently. Everyone is trying to engage and to reach out to different stakeholders, and that's what's going to bring the innovation, and together with innovation, decarbonization.
Wonderful. Yeah, engagement. Yes, that's going to be key. Very quickly, final question. I think we've covered a lot of ground, but do we have cause for optimism reaching the new prize?
I think so, yeah.
Alice?
Simple yes.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Robyn?
Absolutely.
Enthusiastic yes.
Amazing. I like ending on a positive note. Thank you very much to the audience today, and thank you, round of applause to our panelists. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And a little appreciation, token of appreciation, some local delicacies as well. Take a delight.
Ladies and gentlemen of the panel, thank you very much. And I think I've learned a new word, green hushing, as well as greenwashing. But no, that was really, really interesting, working out how, you know, you get carbon down while production needs to go up. Ladies and gentlemen of the panel, thank you very much. Thank you.